In this video, I'm going to show you how I make a French tapered rolling pin on the wood lathe. Hello, welcome to my shop today. One of my best-selling items at craft fairs and farmers markets is a French tapered rolling pin. And the reason that it sells so well and it's been so popular in the last few years is that you get this nice hands-on-top feel so you can feel your dough. It rolls out dough very quickly, and you can also turn with it a little bit easier than you can with a regular rolling pin. What's cool about this project is it's a fairly simple project to do on the wood lathe. But there's some things you need to know to help you get it right and to make it easier for you. And we'll talk about those today in the video. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Jason Geiser and this is Geiserwoodturner. So like and subscribe if you'd like to. And let's make a French tapered rolling pin. While I'm marking out the centers on this blank, I want to talk to you about wood selection for your rolling pin. The first thing I do is choose a good quality hardwood. One thing to think about is that you are making a product that could possibly become a cherished family heirloom, and that the love of using it might be passed down from generation to generation. So choose a wood that is consistent and durable, and that will also help you turn the wood easier on the wood lathe. I try to use a sustainably harvested domestic hardwood so that I'm not putting pressure on forests around the world that don't need that pressure. A rolling pin is a utility item that needs to be food safe, and so I try to use woods that have a closed grain structure so that food particles don't get caught inside. I use a lot of maple, cherry, and walnut is slightly open grain, but it has small pores that usually don't get food down inside, whereas a wood like red oak has large open pores, and I wouldn't use it for a project like this. Today, I'm using a piece of cherry that I got from my local hardware supplier, and I cut it out to be about 2 inches by 2 inches by 19 inches long. And for those of you not in the United States, that's about 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters by 48 centimeters long. So I'm using my spindle roughing gouge to rough this blank into a round cylinder. And if you're not familiar with roughing techniques, I have a video on that, so go check it out. But we'll just smooth this until we have a nice consistent dowel all the way across. Now if I want to make sure that I'm round, I can lightly rest my hand on top of the spinning piece of wood, and I can feel some bumpiness over here. So I'm going to take another pass and make sure that my dowel is completely round. That feels pretty good now. So what I'll do is I'll stop the lathe because my tool rest isn't long enough to go all the way along the whole piece, and we'll move the tool rest down, and then we'll just do the same thing on the other side. So we'll just take one pass at a time and work our way down. And I like to keep my eyes up on top of the piece of wood and not where my tool is, and that gives me a good idea of how consistent I am, and if I'm lining up with the ways or the bed on my lathe, then I can keep a dowel pretty consistent in diameter without having to measure, but we will measure anyways when we're done. A lot of times my fingers will be able to feel things that my eyes can't see. So we'll take one last pass here, and then I'll just feel the consistency of our rolling pin so far. Now, I really want to have some consistency across the center of the rolling pin, probably for about 6 inches through the center. And I'm a little bit high here, so we'll go ahead and take that down so that the diameter matches all across that center. So just nice and slow here, and lighten up that cut as you get closer to the part that you're not trying to cut into. And then we'll check that again with our calipers. So we'll just set them to the diameter where it was highest and just check that out and see where they're at. And that's pretty consistent. We'll go with that. Now I want to set up my calipers so that I can make a tenon on each end. And that'll be a reference point for us to know how far to bring the taper down on each side. And I set my calipers at about 1.25 inches. I like to make tenons on the end with my skew chisel. And I use a peeling cut, which I'll rest the bevel on the piece of wood and raise the handle until it peels away the wood. Now we'll just check it with the calipers and make sure that we're okay. We did pretty good there. And now on the left side, we'll go down with our peeling cut again and just try and make sure that those are consistently the same diameter so that we have consistency and repeatability across our rolling pin. And I need to go just a little bit farther here. So we'll go down just a little bit more. And we'll stop and check, and that's pretty good. Everybody needs a little consistency in their life, especially me. So when I'm doing work that I want to repeat and have it come out the same every time, I use a storyboard or a template to get that result. This is one I've made for my rolling pin. It's got a mark that's 6 inches from each end, or about 15 centimeters. And that way it puts a mark that tells me where I want to take my taper to. Next, we'll start making the taper of our French tapered rolling pin. And I'm going to continue to use my spindle roughing gouge. And the reason for that is it removes a lot of material quickly, and I have a lot of control over the depth of cut just by raising or lowering the handle. And you'll notice that I start on the outside and take a pass, and then I gradually start working my way up towards that line as I make a pass. And that keeps my taper consistent without having to adjust my cut very much. You can do it other ways by starting with less of a cut and then raising the handle and then taking more of a cut down towards the end. But I find it's a lot easier this way to just start out towards the end and work my way towards the line. And you can make this taper like perfectly straight if you want, or you can leave it kind of slightly rounded, which is what I like to do. But whatever works out, I like to take this line at the end and take one last pass and take away that line and just kind of blend everything together as I come down towards where that tenon was, and just barely remove that tenon, and I get a nice consistent finish across the taper. So really you just need to make a taper on the other side, and we'll start out here at the end, and we'll just start working our way across and cutting it deeper and then up a little farther and deeper, and work our way up to our pencil line. And you'll notice that I have the tool locked into my body so that I can keep my angle consistent, and I'm not moving my feet, I'm just rocking my body across, and you'll get a much smoother and more consistent cut if you can do that. You have a lot more control over it if you use your body while you're wood turning. And you can see that I still have a little bit to go on the left. And so I'll take a few more cuts on the left just to kind of bring that diameter down just a little bit more before I get to that line. And then I'll come up to the line, and we'll bring it all the way down and just barely cut off that tenon here on the end now. And now I can do my smoothing cut and blend everything together and take this nice and slow as a finishing cut and take it all the way down. Make that nice and smooth and consistent. Just to make the centers look exactly like the tapers and just as smooth, I'm going to take a final slow pass across the center, just like I did on the tapers, to smooth everything up so that it's really good across the whole rolling pin. So I'll stop the lathe now, and I notice this little inclusion, which is pretty common in cherry. I'll have to just keep that in mind that that's there, because I'll need to fill that before I finish the rolling pin and sand it. And one thing I like to do on the edges here is I like to roll a bead or a round over on the sides. And what that does for me is it gives me a really nice look, as well as it gives me an area that I can cut off on the ends. You can definitely cut these off straight and sand them, and they will look good. I just want to get rid of the marks from my centers that are in the ends. And so I'll come in about maybe 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch, somewhere in that range, just to leave a little waste wood on the end that I can cut off later. And I actually like the rounded look of a French tapered rolling pin when it's rounded on the end. So I'll bring my spindle gouge in and just roll that over until I get a nice consistent corner here. So I'll just go in as far as I can here without going too deep and compromising how much wood is left there to drive the piece so it keeps it spinning. Now we'll come back to that little inclusion. And I'm using Starbond medium brown super glue here. And I'll just fill up that inclusion and hit it with some accelerator. And you may have to do this in a couple of layers, but it helps fill that little void so that we can sand and be ready for finishing. Now, when it comes to sanding, I'm a big fan of power sanding, and I like to use this pneumatic powered die grinder that holds my disc holder and my sanding discs. And when I start up the lathe, I'll turn down the speed to where I'm somewhere around 1,000 to 1,200 RPMs, and I can come across with this sanding disc and just round everything over and smooth everything out as I come across really quickly. It gives me a nice, smooth, consistent sanding finish. You really want to do most of the work with your heaviest grit of sandpaper to remove those tool marks. And if you take your time on this step and get it as smooth as you can, then on all the next grits of sandpaper, as you go up in number, they're going to take a lot less time, and you're basically just removing the scratches that you put in there from your heavier grits of sandpaper. So I'll go ahead and move through the grits. I go to a 180, then to a 240, and then we'll go to a 320 grit. And then my last grit that I usually do is 400 grit. You can go higher than that if you want an even smoother finish, but a rolling pin doesn't necessarily have to be the smoothest finish in the world. Some people like to have their rolling pins completely unfinished, but I've never had a request for one. So to protect the wood, I like to oil them. I use a finish that I make that has walnut oil and some natural waxes like beeswax and carnauba. The oil is there to penetrate into the wood and moisturize it, and it's a polymerizing oil, so it will dry on the surface and help protect it. The waxes are there just to help it look good and feel nice, and will wear away over time. I recommend that you oil your rolling pin several times a year, and never soak it in a sink, and absolutely never put it in a dishwasher. And as you can see here, I like to put on the finish just a little at a time. I'll rub some onto a paper towel and then just move it across the wood and let that soak in and let that heat build up and work that oil into the wood just a little bit. So I'll get all the wood covered, and then I'll just kind of go over it and make sure that I have a good, nice, consistent oil and finish across the rolling pin. Now, instead of just trying to cut these nubs off with a saw or after you're all done, I like to grab my narrow parting tool and just work them down a little bit more. And I leave a little bit of wood there that can be sanded off, because a parting tool is not necessarily the best tool for parting something off. It leaves a little bit of tear out in the end grain of a piece of wood. So as you can see, I'll just kind of make a cut, and then I'll make a clearance cut next to that. And I'll just work my way down to where I'm pretty thin here, and then I'll have enough wood that I can easily take it off with a saw without any problems. And I like to use this little Japanese pull saw that they have at Harbor Freight, and just with a couple of pulls on that, it'll come right off. And then just have to go over and cut off the other end really quickly, and then we can sand the ends and finish them. Now that we've got the ends cut off, we need to sand them. So I'll just remove the center, and I'll put in a disc holder, a sanding disc holder, and a Jacob's chuck, and pop that into the Morris taper of my lathe. And then I'll start out with a 80 grit here, so a little bit heavier than I did before, because I have a lot more material to remove and a little bit of tear out from that parting tool to get down to where I need to be. So this takes a little bit longer, but you'll just sand the end here and work it down until it's smooth and you don't see any of those little white flecks from the tear out that are down in the end of the piece. So it'll look like that. And then before I move on to doing the other grits, I'm going to go ahead and put my maker's mark in the end. This is my way of signing my rolling pins. This is a piece of brass rod that I cut out and put it on a piece of threaded rod and turned a handle for it. And I'll just rotate that, and it takes a couple of minutes to get it hot. Then I put it on a test piece to make sure that it's going to burn through the wood. This is a piece of maple, so I know it's going to burn really well even into the cherry. And while I'm getting ready, I'll just keep that piece warm, rotate it around a little bit, and then I'll grab my rolling pin. And if you can, hang on to your rolling pin really well. Make sure that your hand isn't going to slip. And if you have to put the back of the rolling pin against a wall or on a workbench, it really helps a lot, because you don't want your hand to slip over the rolling pin and onto that hot piece of brass that you're putting on the end, because your hand will close around it. And I found that out the hard way. It was kind of painful for a little while. So make sure you've got a hold of it really tight. Now I can go ahead and continue on with my grits and sand the ends. And I usually go till I'm through the 240 grit, and then my 320 and 400, I'll usually just hand sand those. It takes a little bit less time and works out well that way. I'll take some compressed air and blow that sawdust out of my maker's mark. And I can go ahead and put some finish on both ends and oil those up. And then I take the paper towel and just once over the whole rolling pin to make sure I've got oil on everything. Last thing I'll do is to clean up my maker's mark by blowing some compressed air and cleaning some of that oil and wax out of there. There we go. Have fun making your own rolling pins, and we'll see you soon.